Last week, on April 13, Iran launched a full-scale military attack against Israel by blasting around 300 missiles and drones towards the Jewish capital. Israel's Iron Dome, with the help of the United States, intercepted 99% of the projectiles. Iran's operation was in response to Israel's April 1st attack, when the IDF bombed Iran's embassy in Syria, killing 7 of its military advisors. Today, Israel retaliated despite the US and the UK urging the country to withhold fire. The Jewish state launched a missile attack against a site in Iran, with Iran then firing air defence batteries to shoot down 3 drones. The question now is, what's next? Will this be an ongoing tit-for-tat situation? And if the situation does escalate and it's an all-out war between Iran and Israel, who would win? Here to chat through this with me is former British Colonel Hamish to Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, thanks so much for your time today. Now, Israel dedicates over $24 billion to its defence budget, while Iran's is nearly $10 billion. That's a pretty big disparity given the difference in population. What do you think that says about how much investment is going into each country's military capabilities?
Well, both countries are heavily militarised. But the amount of money that Israel's spending, well over twice that Iran is, I think really points to the sophistication of Israel's military. So the sophistication of its drones, the sophistication of its air defense systems, of its fighters, of its tanks. They're all very modern, really state-of-the-art piece of kit. Whereas Iran, basically, its key premise is quantity, and the quantity of tanks that it has is huge, but they're old ex-Soviet type tanks. The same with its fighters; they're old, and to a degree also even some of its modern weaponry, its drones and its missiles, are of a technology way behind what Israel has. So Iran has mass and quantity, but Israel has technology and state-of-the-art weaponry. And as we've seen in Ukraine, and also as we've seen in the last few days in the Middle East, actually high-tech quality weapons usually overmatch the mass of the old Soviet-type military equipment.
Hamish, you've said to me numerous times in various interviews that, air control is the most important part of a country's military. How does Israel come up on top here?
Yeah, at the moment, what we're seeing is air and air power is what dictates success on the battlefield, and we've seen that in Ukraine. Russia has air superiority, and Russia is making advances. And when we look at what we're seeing in the Middle East at the moment, again, air power is key, and air defense, the ability to counter that, is also key. When we look at these two countries, Israel's fighter jets are the most modern. They've got the F-35Bs, the American stealth fighters, the fighters that can travel around in the air completely unseen by the enemy, the most modern. Also has a lot of other US fighters. When we look at Iran, again, its fighters are aging, predominantly old Russian-type fighters, which are again, although they might be slightly more numerous than the Israeli, but it is almost parity here. But when you look at the quality of Israeli aircraft is vastly superior to Iran. And when it comes to air defense, again, we've talked about the Iron Dome and the other air defense that Israel has. Now, we know that Iran has air defense, but again, most of it is pretty old stuff. They say they've got some modern air defense, but again, that is unproven. Many people remember a couple of years ago when they shot down a civilian airliner leaving Tehran when their air defense went wrong. So when it comes to air power, when it comes to the war in the air and air defense, again, Israel, I think, is vastly superior to Iran.
Well, keeping in the air, Hamish, what about the number of drones? From research, it's kind of hard to pinpoint an exact number from both countries. Is there at least documentation on which country has more?
Well, again, with drones, I don't think it's necessarily a numbers game. However, numbers are important, and again, alluding to the Ukraine conflict, where we've seen the advent of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of what we call $500 drones, these tiny drones that have a camera on that prove hugely effective at the one end. And then at the other end, you have multi-million-dollar drones that really act like aircraft, but they're unmanned. They have the ability to fire missiles. And when you look at those two, Israel is really the father of drone development. Even when I was in the army a few years ago, using drones in Afghanistan and Iraq, that drone technology was Israeli. So they are the absolute masters of it. So when it comes to sophisticated drones, or dronery, however you want to call it, Israel has absolutely the latest and is the leading, technical designer of these things. But looking at Iran is also big in the drone game. The Shahed drones that we're seeing in Ukraine are Iranian, and Russia is buying thousands of these off Iran. These are fairly small drones. They carry a payload of about 50 kilograms of high explosive, and a couple of hundred of them were fired towards Israel last Sunday. They were all shot down. So they are, they're pretty dumb. I would expect or anticipate that Iran has a lot, thousands, tens of thousands of these dumb drones. But a drone's no good if it can't be effective. Whereas Israel has many more of the sophisticated, their Hermes 450, which is a drone I know very well, carries Hellfire missiles. So again, on the drone side, the Israelis have the technology, the latest drones with attack capability, but Iran probably has the mass, has many, many more. But again, if they can't get through air defense, doesn't matter how many you've got, you need to have effective drones.
What about when it comes to land power, Hamish, tanks and vehicles and artillery? We know when it comes to the population, Iran has a far, far greater population than Israel. Do they have enough, weaponry and technology on the ground?
Well, when we look at the ground, and I think the ground is probably of less importance. Well, to try and find a situation where Iran tanks and infantry are attacking directly into Israel or the other way around is not a scenario that I can imagine at this stage. But again, we're looking at equipment, looking at manpower, first of all, you're absolutely right. Iran has many, many more soldiers. But when it comes to the capability of those soldiers, the Israeli soldiers are the most highly trained soldiers in the world, along with the Brits and the Americans, and very, very well equipped with a whole range of capabilities. Except for the elite Iranian forces, the standard infantry in Iran will be fairly basically equipped. The other thing I think to consider here is also morale. In Israel, virtually everybody does some sort of military service, and everybody wants to defend and fight for Israel. Where you look at Iran, and although they've got huge numbers, we look back to the Iran-Iraq war between 1984 and 88, where Iran lost hundreds of thousands of troops. These were, press gang conscripts. So the majority of the Iranian army is conscript. Have an unpopular government, and their effectiveness is in question. So it's the general premise of this thing. Israel tends to have less military capability than Iran, but what it has is much more modern, much more sophisticated, and much more determined. So, when we look at these things in the round, one would expect that the Israelis to perform overall far better than the Iranians.
It is interesting, that point on morale, Hamish, because if you look at the numbers, it's, the Israeli population is something like 9 million, and the amount of capable militants is something like 6 million. And it's a huge majority of the population that are willing to fight if circumstances needed it. But getting into naval power, from your experience working in an army, how important is it to have, a dominance on the water, whether it be submarines or fleets as well as ports? Which, Israel or Iran, which country kind of favours in that area?
Well, Iran has a much larger navy, certainly, than Israel, but Iran is a massive country. As you said, it's many times larger than Israel. Israel has a fairly small coastline and a fairly small amount of ports. So the navy that it has is probably more than sufficient to protect them. On the other side, of course, also on the submarine piece, which of course Israel and Iran can deploy all over the place. Again, Iran has many more submarines, but critically, it's expected, or people believe, that Israel's nuclear capability, nuclear deterrent, is in its submarines. And we know at the moment Iran doesn't have a nuclear deterrent, and perhaps we'll come on to that. But on the Navy side, I don't think this is key in this particular scenario here, because in all of this, we mustn't forget that the American fleet is also buzzing around protecting Israel. And although the Russians are allies with Iran, their focus is elsewhere at the moment. And I don't think the Chinese at this stage would come in to support them. So the Navy issue, I would say, in simplification, it's probably parity, and nobody has a distinct advantage in that area.
Hamish, going on to what you were saying there, obviously, about the United States, and they're obviously Israel's biggest protector. And then obviously, Russia could eventually get involved protecting Iran. We don't know that. But if there were to be a hypothetical situation of Israel versus Iran today, do you have a thought on who would win that? No interference from any allies?
Yeah, I pretty much so. I think the Israelis would probably prevail, because this is going to be a war. The most likely conflict will be fought in the air, and air defence will be key. When it comes to air power, Israel, I think, is far superior to Iran, and would be able to attack all the key areas that it would want to in Iran. I don't think the Iranian air defence would be able to stop F-35Bs, for instance. And we've already seen the capability of the Israeli air defence system. So I think that Iran, even if it decided to put fighters in the sky towards Israel, I expect they would be shot down way before they even got there. And the sort of the final piece of this, of course, is the nuclear piece. And Israel has nuclear weapons, Iran doesn't at the moment. So I think everybody's fully aware of all of this, which is why one hopes that even when Israel retaliates, which presumably it probably will do in the next few days or weeks, that might well be the end of it. Because I think that the Ayatollahs in Tehran know that if they go toe-to-toe, nose-to-nose with the Israelis, that they are going to get a very bloody nose. And that's quite apart with everybody else not getting involved. So hopefully that will give some solace to people who, there's a lot of talk around at the moment that this is going to develop into some sort of nuclear conflict. Well, it's not, because Iran at the moment doesn't have nuclear weapons, and we must ensure that they don't. And people concerned it's going to be some great ground battle. Well, I can't see the Israelis deploying troops, all across the Arabian Peninsula to fight Iran. And conversely, I can't see the Iranians doing the same. I mean, they might well put their proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and some of their militias from Syria and Iraq to try and attack Israel. But I don't think they'll get very close. So at the moment, Israel, I think, holds the whip hand. and of course with the backing of the US, which
Yeah.
is the only true superpower at the moment, that they should prevail.
Well, getting into that, Hamish, because it's obviously the reality is, and we can't be naive in thinking that this would be Israel versus Iran, solely the two countries fighting it out, because there would be interference with other countries on both sides of the aisle. And as you said before, this probably would be a fight in the air because, you know, there's Jordan and Syria and Iraq all sitting between these two countries. It's not easy to be having soldiers walking across to each country. So can you run me through what you think a situation would look like for, you know, the average person who doesn't know what an air war would look like between Israel and Iran and the various allies on both sides?
Well, the other significant country in all of this that we must mention is Saudi Arabia, which again bizarrely supports Israel. One I think people through the years have always thought they're arch enemies, but actually Saudi supports Israel and was involved in the defense of Israel last Sunday, and is sworn enemies to the Ayatollahs in Iran. So, you know, with all that air power around and all the support, I think all the military capability would be going one way. One would expect Israeli missiles, cruise missiles, and particularly the stealth fighter jets, the F-35Bs, to be attacking, you know, the key airfields in Iran, the nuclear facilities, and with a really sharp, hard bang to do that. Now, it might well be that Iran would react, but I can't see their fighters getting very close to Israel. If the US and the UK and the other allies like Jordan continue to support Israel, I think any missiles and drones fired from Iran wouldn't get very far either. If you accept this premise, you would come to the conclusion that you know, there is no way that Iran would do anything more than it did the other day, because it would be sure that they would get absolutely hammered, and the Ayatollahs, who are in a fairly tenuous position in Iran at the moment, would know it would be the end for them. So when we look at all that, what one is hopeful that a wider conflict in the Middle East can be avoided. But one mustn't forget it as well, when looking at it from the Iranian side, we've got the Russians, who Putin is keen that this situation develops as much as possible. And the focus of the West at the moment is totally on the Middle East and not what is going on in Ukraine, where the Ukraine forces are under severe pressure. And if things go badly in Ukraine, particularly for us in the UK, that could draw us into war in Europe. Whereas, you know, I don't believe what's happening in the Middle East could create a war that would directly involve anybody except those in the vicinities of the Middle East.
Hamish, how do you, going back to the neighbouring countries of Iran and Israel, how do you think the situation would change for Israel if Syria were to totally back Iran, almost like a joint forces situation, because obviously Syria is right next to Israel?
Well, that's a good point. And Syria has always been a very close ally of Iran. Of course, it's the Iran militias that have kept President Assad in power. The Syrian army is quite strong. But again, you know, the Syrian military has the same sort of equipment as Iran. Syria has been beaten up badly a number of times over the last 30 or 40 years by Israel when they've ever tried to confront them. So I don't think Syria would really make much difference to all of this. Of course, Syria also has a very large boundary with Saudi Arabia. The Syrians don't want to get thumped by the Saudis as well as everybody else. So, you know, I think beyond President Assad allowing the Iranian National Guard, Republican Guard, and Iranian militias and terrorists to operate from Syria, I should think he'd be pretty keen not to deploy his much depleted forces. So I think, you know, it might be a good presentational thing for the Iranians to draw on, but actually practically I don't think it'd make a lot of difference.
You mentioned this before, Hamish, but just on nuclear weapons, It's hard to compare Israel and Iran in that area because Israel have nukes and Iran doesn't. But is there a likely scenario that nukes would be involved in some capacity? Because even if Iran doesn't have any, Russia could offer some up from their stockpile.
Um, I think the nuclear scenario is fairly unlikely for the points you make that Israel has nuclear weapons and Iran doesn't. I would thought it would be highly unlikely for the Russians to loan, if you like, nuclear weapons to Iran. I think the last thing that the Kremlin and Putin and his gangsters want is for the US and others to target them with nuclear weapons. So I think the nuclear issue is it's something that terrifies people. It's something that gets headlines, but actually, again, as we've seen in Ukraine, it's a bit of a paper tiger because Putin and his other close supporters have threatened nuclear attack virtually since day one of the war in Ukraine, and it's had the opposite effect. So I think even if the Ayatollahs went to the Kremlin and said, "Lend us some nuclear weapons," I'm sure they wouldn't. And there seems to be a bit of confusion going on at the moment. Some people suggesting that Iran already has nuclear weapons. Yeah, I don't get that. I think that's not the case yet, but they are trying to. So I think looking to the future, we need to make sure that they don't get them, because if we look at this same scenario, say in 10 years hence, where Iran did have nuclear weapons, then we would be in a very different scenario. And a nuclear slugging match between Israel and Iran would turn into a global nuclear slugging match, I'm sure. But I think at the moment, nuclear should not be an issue.
Hamish, to wrap up, obviously this is a discussion who would win in a war, Iran versus Israel. In a hypothetical situation, an all-out war did break out tomorrow. Allies on both sides were involved. Who do you think would win?
Well, there are so many variables here which one has to sort of put out of our mind. But in a purely military match, I think it is, in my mind, it's pretty clear that the Israelis would prevail with their modern technology, their morale, their desire to protect their homeland, and of course, if you bring the Allies in as well, whatever huffing and puffing we get out of the Kremlin, all the dreadful things we're seeing in Ukraine, at the end of the day, there is only one superpower, and that's the US. And if the US lent behind Israel, they would undoubtedly prevail, whoever Iran might have as its sort of neighbours and supporters.
Hamish to Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure.